So today we are going to look at how to put on hook and eye tape. Hook and eye tape is a great way to secure the back of a bodice or some sort of garment where you would need multiple rows of hooks. Honestly, it takes a long time to sew on each individual hook and loop. So this is a great way to do this in a very quick manner as opposed to having to do it over a prolonged period of time. So when we're doing this, you just need to know a little bit about the hooks and eyes. So this is hook and eye tape. It comes in lots of different styles. Mostly I get it now through a company that focuses on corset and bra making supplies. But you can find it through sometimes like Wawak or places like that. But what I do want to look at is that you want to make sure a lot of times it might be sold separately, it might be sold together, but you need to make sure that the spacing is going to be correct before you start to put these on your garments so that it doesn't cause any gapping. So you can see that if I were to close these two, they close nicely, they don't have any spacing in between, and that's what we're looking for. The other thing to consider when we're looking at hook and eye tape is how many rows of the eyes do you need, or loops. Sometimes it has multiple rows. So you can see here that this particular style, which is something we might see on the back of a bra strap or something, has multiple rows. Generally, this is great for undergarments, but if I'm doing this for a finished bodice, then I don't need these additional rows. I really just need the single row. So you can choose which one works best for your project. So today we're going to focus on just having a single row of eyes in the single row of hooks. So the other thing to note is that when we put these on, we are going to be folding these backwards. So when we're sewing this, and also when we sew on this one, we're going to be sewing it from the top side. So I just want to caution you before you start sewing that you do need to take this slow. Know that it takes a little bit of patience to get these secured correctly by machine. When you stitch these on, a lot of times for the hooks, they're going to be at a 90-degree angle, sort of pointing upwards like this. I want to make sure that I'm avoiding all of the metal that's in here. When I sew on the loops, I am going to be sewing over the back side where I can't see. I'm going to be sewing a little bit blind. I'm not going to be able to see where these eyes are. And those are metal pieces in there. So if you hit those with your sewing machine needle, it will break. The other thing that I would recommend you do is that whatever your finished length is, once you're done, you're going to want to go ahead and do some kind of finish to the edge of your hook and eye tape. You could try to serge it. It's a bit difficult and a bit risky because you are going over some metal here. So a lot of times what I like to do is just zig it over. Now this particular piece, when we are said and done, this goes on this side and this is going to fold back like that, and this will be sticking out like that. So this edge needs to be really nice and finished because it is more visible than some of the other pieces, where the other one is going to be completely hidden. So it's going to be like this, and it's going to be completely on the underside. So we don't need to worry about what that seam finish looks like as long as my fabric is not going to fray. So one of the things that I will do is when I sew this one finished, I can actually fold this under when I sew this down, so that raw edge will be completely encased. I did go ahead and zigzag it though, because sometimes you don't have enough fabric to fold under, so you can just zig that edge and that will work just fine. On the other side, what I did is I actually folded it over, so it's folded over about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. And then I have zigged over that edge so that it's securing it nicely. If I had done this in white, you wouldn't even hardly notice it. But because I did do it in a contrasting color, it does give it a little bit of an appearance that I wouldn't necessarily want on a finished garment. But for today's lesson, it works fine. So we are going to first focus on doing our hook tape. So we're going to set the eye tape aside. Now, I did go ahead and prep 2 pieces of fabric that were 6 inches by 8 inches. And I also have flatted these so that I have a nice fashion cotton on the one side and I have a sort of canvas on the other side. This is just to sort of mimic what a bodice would be like. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what your project is going to call for. So, and I did serge the edges. I have 2-inch seam allowance on the back of this, which is a good guidance for seam allowance. And we're gonna start from there. So my hooks are gonna go on the right side because I am doing sort of the back of a bodice, and generally you are going to hook the right side over the left side on a bodice. This is just a standard protocol of how we do closures. It's helpful for wardrobe if they're doing quick changes to be able to do it easily. So on the other side of this, you can see I have my stitch line, and with my stitch line I am going to be marking my first line inside my seam allowance of this stitch line. So using my ruler, and I'm going to use my friction marker here, I am going to line that up, and I just want to give myself a 1/8 inch space there. Now, the reason why I'm marking 1/8 of an inch into my seam allowance is because I actually want when I fold this back, and it will be folded straight on that seam allowance line, I want this to not sit on the edge. I want it to sit just a little tiny bit inside of that edge so that I don't accidentally see the tape, and also it helps overlap just a tiny bit so that I don't get any gapping in the center back seam. So I'm always going to mark that center back line just 1/8 of an inch in, and then I'm going to be pinning directly onto that. So now for pinning. So I am going to basically fold this upright, and that space there is where we're going to be stitching. So I don't usually mark this, but I will mark it for us today, just for ease of being able to see where you want to have that sit. And so it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the base of the hooks. And again, I'm just going to lightly mark that so that I have a good line for pinning to. Now the other thing I'm going to need to do is make sure that I have my hook placement exactly where I want it to be. Now generally, if I was doing this for an actual bodice, I would take out one of these hooks and have this be a little bit shorter and center this so that I have some space there. For today's sample, we'll go ahead and keep all 6 hooks. And so I'm just going to start it just about 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch down from either side. So once I have that placement where I want it to start, then we're going to pin this. And so for pinning this, I am going to keep this at that 90-degree angle that I discussed before, making sure my hook is exactly where I want it to be. And then I am going to pin this, as you can see, I have it on my stitch line there, my stitch line on this side, and I'm going to pin it. Now you want to make sure that your hooks, when you pin this, are laying with the hook side on the right side of the fabric, because this is going to eventually get folded back. So again, I'm just going to keep with right sides together in essence. My hook's laying flat down on the right side of my fabric. I'm going to continue to pin, and I'm just pinning stitch line to stitch line. And once I have this, I'm now going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I am going to sew this directly on those lines. Now, what I mentioned before, I just want to remind you, is that when you sew this, it is going to be stitched like this. These are going to be standing upright at a 90-degree angle, so you can see that they don't lay down flat. You want them to be sort of upright. So when you're sewing, you just have to be careful that this doesn't get folded over. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to go all the way to the edge because I do want to fold these edges in when I'm done. So I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch down on both and stop 1/4 inch from the bottom so I can fold those in when I'm done. And I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end. So we will do that and I will be right back. So we are back. I have stitched this. You can see that I've stitched directly on my line here. And I've stitched directly to that new line that I marked 1/8 of an inch from my seam allowance. The pencil mark is where I'm actually going to fold it back, and my 1/8 inch into the seam allowance line is there. And so back stitch at the beginning and the end. And I also did stop a little bit short so that I can fold this in when I go to make that next step. So I'm going to clip my seam allowance or my threads. My own personal pet peeve is unclipped threads. And we are going to move on to the next step. So once we have this to the right length, we are going to then fold this in, and we are going to fold this back. So you want to just fold it up against the stitch line. The stitch line's right there. We're going to go ahead and fold that straight back against there. And I'm going to secure this. And again, do the same at the bottom. I'm going to fold in the bottom. And then I'm going to fold this back. Now some people like to not do the first step and they'll just fold this over and stitch it down. When you do that, you have to hand stitch it. You can't actually get your sewing machine in around those hooks. So I like to do this method just because it does machine stitch everything, which keeps everything really nice and secure. So my next step is to go ahead and we're going to stitch along that line. You can see that I have secured this side down with the stitch line, and so it's nice on this side and secure. I folded under the tops and the bottoms so I don't have any edges showing, and on the back side you can see we have 2 rows of stitching here, and then this is my line that we're going to be folding it back. So that's my next step, is to just go ahead and fold this back. That means I should have, in theory, just a hair of the fashion fabric showing beyond my hook and eye tape, and that's ideally what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a press right along that line. The hooks always make it a little bit challenging to press because you can't really press over them very easily. And then the last step on this side is to go ahead and we're going to pin this down. I'm actually going to pin it this direction because of the way I'm going to want to sew this. My canvas I chose is quite dense, so it does not like my pins, especially when I'm going through 2 layers. Now usually I will go ahead and cross stitch this down. I like a good cross stitch to anchor this. You do want to anchor it quite well, but if you don't, oftentimes I don't want to see the stitching on the outside of my garment. So I'm really only anchoring it to the canvas layer. So when you sew, you just want to be very careful and only anchor it to the canvas. So this side, other than doing the cross stitching, is good to go. So this one looks really good. And so we're going to jump over and we're going to look at the eye tape now. We're going to look at the eye tape. So we have our hook tape on here and secure, and you can see that it just needs to be cross stitched down. But here's where my eyes are, or my hooks are. My eyes need to line up exactly with where those hooks line up. And this is the first part that I think is the most challenging. So oftentimes what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these down so that they're laying on top of each other just as they would be, and making sure that I'm lining up where I want it to line up. And so that is a good lineup there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and mark each place where I have a hook. So I can see when I pull this back, I have a hook here. I have a hook here. Now sometimes I'm not marking every single hook. I might mark every other hook. We only have 6 hooks here, so this is an easy one for us to just go ahead and do all of them. This is a very important step so that we make sure that once our eyes are secured to the fabric and we hook it together, that we create a straight line, that we aren't having the bodice sitting crooked because the center back is not lined up, because you don't want it to hook and all of a sudden it's hooking like this, or the other way. And so this is also a really good time to double check and make sure your lengths are the same. This is more critical when we're doing a finished bodice, where you may have piped the edges. If your piping lengths are not the same, you will need to go back and fix that first, then put your hooks and hook and eye tape on. Hook and eye tape is usually the very last step. So now that I have this, I'm going to want to make sure that when I lay these on here, and I'm just going to fold this back so we can see it, that these are laying centered over where I have those pins. And so that is the placement that I'm going to want to have on this one, because I have a hook for each one of these loops. And so keeping that in place there, and also just making sure that I have my right sides down. And this is going to, you want to make sure, and I always just do a double check, you want to make sure that when these fold back, that your hooks are actually sticking out, that you haven't somehow flipped it around. So those are all important parts for us to think about. Now we have here on the hooks, there is a stitch line that is sort of securing the fabric that goes over the edges of the loops. So you can see it's this fabric here, there's this stitch line here. So that is exactly where we want to stitch to our stitch line so it can fold back. So I've went ahead and marked that so we can see that a little bit more clearly. And on this side, I want to make sure that I am stitching, I'm going to hook up exactly, pin it and stitch it directly to my folding line, because I want these to stick out a little bit. So there's my line there. We can sort of see where the pins are underneath. They're actually sort of lining up. And I'm going to make sure that when this gets folded back, that those are sticking outwards. And I am going to also make sure that my pins are laying where they're supposed to. My pins and my eyes line up. And now we're going to start to go ahead and pin these together. So using my stitch lines here, if it will cooperate, maybe I'll start below. This canvas really does not like my pins. And that's not an uncommon problem. So just to make sure that I'm not shifting, because if I just take this, now I've got these pinned line to line, but if I do this, I've now shifted my loop, my eye. So I am going to do that, and then I'm going to put a cross pin straight across, making sure I haven't shifted that, so that my loop, my eye, is still laying directly over where I want it to be. And then I'm going to do a pin along the line, making sure that I haven't shifted it the other direction either. This is an important step to make sure that you haven't shifted all of your loops so that your top and bottom no longer line up. So I'm going to do the top one, and then I'm going to do the bottom one just to make sure that everything is laying where it's supposed to. So again, I'm going to, I've got my my loop is lining up right over my pin, and I'm going to then just make sure that I'm on my stitch line or my fold back line, the center back seam, and I'm going to cross pin. This is one of those tasks that can cause you to stab yourself several times. Come on. So then we're going to go ahead. Once I have those, then I can come in here and pin all the rest of them. Just checking as I go along and making sure that my pins and my loops still line up. I find it's important to do the hook tape first because I can always fudge the loops a little bit more than the hooks. The hooks are a little less flexible. So now that I have this pinned together, and I have this ready to go, and I'm double checking, see my loops and my pins still line up. I am now going to stitch this directly on there. I'm going to have to stretch it a little bit. The pins, when I pinned it, did sort of seize it up a little bit, but I am confident that that's going to resolve itself once it's stitched and I don't have all these pins in here. So we are going to stitch this and then we'll be right back. Here we have, I've stitched this down. You can see it was stitched directly over that line that I marked, and then also to my center back stitch line here. The other thing I want to point out is that I did have to replace the needle at the very beginning because, as I mentioned before, we are sewing directly over the metal of these loops. So it causes a conflict with the machine because it does not like to go over and through metal. So you can see here I've marked where there's like little thread marks on the back of this that always indicate where that hook is. And so as I approach this, I always hand crank my machine over these spots, and that is so that I don't break my needle, because it is very prone to needle breakage. The other thing that I did want to mention that I neglected to say when I stitched down the hook tape is that on the hook tape I almost exclusively use a zipper foot so that I can get in there and not have to worry about interfering with these hooks, which do not like to be stitched over at all. So we stitch as close as we can to them. So now that I have this all stitched, I can remove these, and this is a good time for me to double check and make sure that everything lines up before I move forward, because this is going to be stitched back like this. So just hooking these together, and I don't need to do all of them, I can just do sort of the tops and the bottoms. I can double check and see that this is lining up like I want to. And so you can see it's lining up beautifully here, and it's lining up pretty good here. My eye side is just a little bit longer, so I'd want to fix that. And it's also overlapping just a little bit, so I don't get a lot of gappage in between the hook and the eye tape. So the placement is great on this. So pulling those back apart, my next step is to go ahead and press this back. So I'm going to, because that's exactly where my stitch line is and my center black mark, I'm just going to press that down nice and good. And then we are going to secure this edge to the seam allowance only. So I could go ahead and pin that. And I'm not stitching that all the way through. I'm only stitching that to the seam allowance. So I will open this up flat again and secure that. And then we'll be back to finish this up. So here we have gone ahead and I've stitched the second row of stitching to the seam allowance, securing this outer edge. So now when I fold this back, and then we've already pressed this so it's laying very nicely, then I am going to need to go ahead and secure this to the other side. So I'm going to flip this back, and we are going to pin this in place for now, and I'm going to cross stitch this so that these stay all the way back. So then that will be my next step, and once we've done that, then we will have our hook and eye tape ready to go. So I will go ahead and cross stitch these back, and then we will just recap. Alright, so here we are on our last step, and I have now secured the back. As you can see, it's a nice tight cross stitch. It's really important that this not be too wide, so that there's gaps. You want it to be really tight because it does pull considerably and takes a lot of strain. Also notice how it does not go through to the outside layer if you have a double layer here. You want to make sure that you're keeping that only on the canvas or couture layer. So that's important to keep in mind. And now I can hook this closed, and we will be all set. Couple of pointers that I do want to just remind you of. Make sure you're using a zipper foot when you're sewing on the hook tape. Make sure you hand crank the machine when you're sewing the eye tape so you don't break your needle. Make sure you're really lining these up so that they line up and look beautiful as one piece. That looks really great. I'm very happy with the way this turned out today. And you can see this is what it looks like on the inside. So good luck with your sample, and I look forward to seeing them when they're done.